I found the contract in his safe. First line, my name. Second line, transfer. After 8 months of a cold, loveless marriage, my Mafia husband finally claimed me as his own, only to secretly trade me to his sworn enemy in the dark. I thought I had won his heart, but I was just a pawn.
The subject, Ravenna, presents a fascinating study in behavioral adaptation. To understand her psychological fragments, we must examine the night she abandoned her marital conditioning. For 8 months, she operated under the delusion of a contract with Santino Valeri, a textbook megalomaniacal narcissist who treated human connection as a mere transactional ledger. When he finally verbalized his rejection, her defense mechanism was not grief, but a calculated, manic defiance. She donned a prohibited red garment of visual rebellion and infiltrated a hostile environment. She signaled her new status as an active threat to the very man who sought to erase her. The lesson here is simple. True rebellion does not require tears. It only requires absolute, cold clarity. Let us open this preliminary case file by observing the environment that bred such intense psychological isolation. Ravenna exhibited classic obsessive-compulsive soothing behaviors, spending 40 minutes perfectly aligning silverware and crystal, folding linen into exact symmetrical shapes. This was her attempt to establish control in a chaotic dynamic. At the 8-month mark of her confinement with Santino, she staged a dinner devoid of romantic stimuli. No candles, which would indicate desperate attachment. No flowers, which would signal clinical delusion. Just fine china and 2 seats separated by a massive physical distance, perfectly mirroring the severe emotional void existing between captor and captive. The physical setting is crucial for our analysis. The Valeri compound, situated 40 minutes north of Chicago, functioned as an architectural isolation chamber. It was vast enough to ensure the subjects rarely intersected, a spatial arrangement Santino deliberately engineered to maintain dominance. Ravenna initially misdiagnosed this severe avoidance as a temporary adjustment phase, a common cognitive distortion in early trauma bonding. Santino utilized the guest quarters, leaving her the master suite, a hollow consolation prize. When he failed to arrive for the scheduled meal, she remained tethered to the dining chair. A hierarchy of domestic staff served as their only buffer, ensuring every communication was filtered, delayed, and stripped of any genuine human intimacy. You and I know that in criminal syndicates, a rigid chain of command replaces familial affection. Ravenna sat paralyzed, unconsciously manipulating a wedding band that was physically too tight, a brilliant, somatic manifestation of her psychological constriction. She suffered this pain silently, symptomatic of her deep conditioning. When Santino's vehicle illuminated the room, the meal had already grown cold. He dismissed his security with 2 curt syllables. Observe how her posture automatically straightened at the sound of his footsteps, an involuntary trauma response to an apex predator. Santino entered the space, his dark, calculating eyes scanning the environment to assess threats and leverage before assigning any fundamental human value to his waiting wife. Over the preceding 8 months, the subject had been thoroughly indoctrinated into the terror associated with the Valerii bloodline. She noted how civilians lowered their vocal registers in his presence, a conditioned response to generational violence in Chicago. She actively employed deliberate ignorance regarding the lethal methods he used to secure his authority, a classic survival strategy. Santino governed both his criminal enterprise and his household with the exact same pathology, total, unyielding totalitarianism. Upon seeing the meticulously arranged table, his facial micro-expressions revealed not gratitude, but clinical recognition. He identified her emotional labor, evaluated it as a profound vulnerability, and then silently ascended the staircase without a single word. Ravenna initiated a passive-aggressive verbal engagement, a weak attempt to reclaim agency. Santino paused on the staircase without offering the respect of visual contact. He stated he had work, delivering the phrase with a chilling, terminal finality. Those 3 words functioned as a psychological reinforcement of her absolute insignificance, identical to every abandoned morning coffee and locked door she had endured. As he retreated, a profound sense of humiliation manifested physically within her gastrointestinal tract. This distress was amplified by her fundamental error. She had dared to cultivate hope. Driven by an escalating need for conflict resolution, she ascended the dimly lit corridor toward his private study. We see here the captive actively seeking out her emotional captor. The visual stimuli of the study were meticulously designed by Santino to project authority and diminish intruders. Ravenna bypassed normal social protocols by entering without permission. She found him fortified behind a massive oak desk, consuming alcohol. The ambient lighting cast severe shadows across his facial structure, enhancing his predatory features against the dark backdrop of the estate's exterior. When he looked at her, he deployed a specialized gaze meant to evoke feelings of trespassing and invalidity. She boldly asserted her status as his spouse, demanding his administrative tasks yield to her emotional distress. Instead of engaging, Santino utilized silence as a weapon. He observed her over his glass, employing the chilling patience of a narcissist, waiting for a victim to break. Observe this interaction as it perfectly illustrates his behavioral methodology. Santino relied on passive attrition, waiting for an uncomfortable situation to resolve itself through the sheer force of his indifference. But the subject did not retreat. She advanced, reducing the physical distance between them to a critical threshold. At this proximity, she processed sensory data: the scent of his cologne, the sharp alcohol, and an underlying biological exhaustion. She attempted to initiate physical contact, a minor gesture requiring massive psychological effort on her part. His response was immediate and autonomic. He recoiled sharply, rejecting her touch entirely. Her hand lingered in the void before she quietly questioned the foundational purpose of their arranged marriage. Ravenna acknowledged her role as a commodity, a debt settled between patriarchal figures. However, she challenged the cognitive dissonance of his cruelty, asking why he acquired a wife, only to subject her to total emotional starvation. This direct confrontation triggered a micro-expression in Santino, a momentary fracture in his carefully narcissistic facade, quickly suppressed. He commanded her to sleep, attempting to re-establish dominance. When she refused, he altered his physical posture, leaning into her space to project pure intimidation. Maintaining intense, unbroken eye contact, he delivered a devastating verbal strike. He stated, with clinical precision, that he never desired her as a partner. The words hung in the air between them, absolute, catastrophic, and irreversible. A true megalomaniac offers no verbal anesthetics. Santino deployed his statement to maximize psychological trauma. Ravenna experienced an acute physiological response, the swelling of tear ducts and a profound sense of systemic collapse. Yet it is here we observe a fascinating divergence in her pathology. The same resilience that allowed her to survive a transactional marriage stepped forward to intercept her grief. She realized weeping would merely provide him the narcissistic supply he sought. We must remember a vital truth. True survival often means denying your destroyer the evidence of your pain. She repressed the biological urge to cry, elevated her posture to simulate strength, and evacuated the hostile environment without uttering a single syllable. The subject navigated the corridor with outward composure, while internally experiencing a catastrophic psychological fragmentation. Once secured inside the master suite, she remained still, allowing her nervous system to process the auditory memory of his rejection echoing in her mind. Slowly, the paralyzing humiliation was replaced by a highly volatile secondary emotion: intense rage. This is a crucial turning point in trauma bonding, where the captive's suppressed anger finally overrides their desperate need for the captor's validation. Driven by this new autonomic response, she approached her storage area. She reached deep into the recesses to retrieve a specific garment, a dress she had purposefully hidden after Santino had previously commanded its immediate eradication from the estate. Let us analyze the symbolism of this specific garment. It was a provocative red dress, purchased during a period when her self-expression was not regulated by a criminal syndicate. When Santino first observed it, his immediate decree to banish it was a classic exercise of totalitarian control over her physical autonomy. Now, she understood her subconscious motivation for preserving it. She utilized the mirror to observe her transformation, manually securing the zipper with the practiced independence of a woman conditioned by profound emotional neglect. She then extracted a deeply pigmented crimson lipstick from a dark cosmetic pouch. As she applied the pigment, she was not merely altering her physical appearance. She was carefully constructing an entirely new, deeply hostile psychological armor. The individual reflected in the glass had successfully dissociated from the victim, who pleaded for affection minutes prior. Seeking logistical support for her rebellion, she initiated contact with Ottavia Marchetti. Tavi was an anomaly in Ravenna's ecosystem, the offspring of a law-abiding accountant, possessing a fearless, Tutivan disposition and a fiercely protective loyalty. When the call connected, ambient noise and casual chewing indicated civilian normalcy. Ravenna requested the coordinates for an event hosted by Corvex, a known rival element in the underworld. The auditory response was telling. Complete silence followed the violent physiological reaction of choking. The sheer audacity of the request had successfully disrupted even her closest ally's mental equilibrium. Let us examine the psychological breaking point of our subject, Ravenna. She calmly requests the address of Arsen Korvax, the sworn enemy of her husband. Her associate, Tavi, responds with incredulous delight, noting she will arrive at Lincoln Park in 40 minutes. When Ravenna observes herself in the mirror, she does not see a wife. The red dress she wears is not merely fabric. It is a calculated rebellion against 8 months of profound sensory and emotional deprivation. For months, she slept alone in a massive suite, functioning as a discarded object. Now, a slow smile breaks across her painted lips. Her dry eyes reflect a terrifying cognitive shift. The victim is learning to weaponize her own neglect. Santino Valerius, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, had discarded her. He was about to experience the volatile consequences of a marginalized psyche deciding to assert its own existence. The cab halts before an iron gate in Lincoln Park. Tavi squeezes the subject's hand, offering a final chance to retreat. But Tavi is already smiling, smoothing the hastily chosen black dress. In the clinical space of behavioral analysis, we often see this moment of no return. Ravenna's heart hammers a rapid rhythm of fight or flight, yet she verbalizes pure defiance. If she intended to regress to her prior state of submissive isolation, she would never have left the house. The words mask the profound terror of her own newfound autonomy. Arsen Korvax uses architectural grandiosity to establish dominance. His mansion dominates the block, with tall windows bleeding golden light and heavy bass onto the pavement. 2 guards check the perimeter, but Tavi bypasses them with manipulative charm. Inside the ballroom is a meticulously engineered environment. The acoustic mod calibrated to foster conspiratorial whispers, while Low immediately identifies three individuals. Ravina previously dined at three individuals who had previously dined at Santino's table. Their micro-expressions register instant shock. In the complex hierarchy of criminal syndicates, the neglected wife of a rival capo has suddenly materialized as an unpredictable and highly volatile anomaly. You and I must observe the predator approaching. Arsen Korvax advances within 10 steps. He is 39, possessing broad shoulders and a remarkably insincere smile. His ocular movements clinically appraise every guest by their potential purchase value. Ravina had monitored his name during Santino's tense phone calls, a persistent, unsolved variable in her husband's criminal calculus. Now the physical manifestation of that stressor extends a hand with a theatrical bow. He addresses her as Ravena Valerius, admitting his surprise. Her response is a textbook assertion of identity reclamation. She firmly shakes his hand and corrects him. Ravena Altieri. She clinically dissociates from her captor, defining the Valerius surname as a mere legal contract. By reclaiming her maiden name, Ravena asserts psychological independence. Arsen emits a predatory laugh that reverberates across the entire ballroom. Tavi applies physical pressure to Ravena's elbow, a nonverbal warning to de-escalate. But the subject has already bypassed the threshold of caution the moment she donned the red dress. The auditory stimuli shift to a slower tempo, and Arsen extends his hand. Accepting this dance is a public, highly dangerous psychological declaration. Ravena understands that every observer will weaponize this data. Yet, the trauma of 8 months of invisibility demands an equal and opposite reaction. They dance briefly. Arsen maintains a rigidly respectful distance, calculating that further intrusion would trigger a premature war. The subject is hyper-aware of the collective scrutiny, yet she maintains a deliberate smile. It is her sole psychological defense mechanism. Suddenly, the environmental baseline dramatically fractures. Tavi whispers a warning as the music fades into the background of Ravena's mind. The kinetic energy of the room resonates. We see a classic herd response to an apex predator. Santino Valerius stands at the threshold, flanked by his enforcer, Beck. His dark jacket is buttoned, his posture radiating the absolute territorial dominance of a megalomaniac narcissist who has breached hostile ground. Before processing the structural threat of the rival faction, Santino's gaze violently locks onto his runaway wife. Santino processes the visual stimuli, the red dress, the painted lips, his rival's hand hovering near his property. You and I can see the precise neurological shift in his facial micro-expressions. His jaw locks tightly. The fingers of his right hand curl into a rigid fist. The clinical calculation vanishes, replaced by pure reptilian reaction. In response, Ravena executes a masterclass in psychological provocation. Anchored by the lingering effects of what we might call a fractured Stockholm syndrome, she looks directly into her captor's eyes, raises her painted fingers, and deliberately blows a kiss. The room enters a state of suspended animation. Arsen allows a smile of deep political satisfaction. Santino begins his approach. Notice the kinetic efficiency of a psychopath in motion. Santino does not run. He advances with heavy, deliberate strides, and the surrounding crowd instinctively clears a path to avoid collateral damage. Upon reaching his target, he secures her wrist with a grip that is authoritative rather than brutal, silently initiating extraction. Arsen attempts a verbal intervention, but Santino neutralizes the rival capo with a single lethal stare. The Serbian boss takes a step backward, a micro-capitulation broadcasted to the entire syndicate. Ravina is swiftly guided out the side door into the frigid night, where a black transport vehicle waits. He forces her into the rear compartment and violently secures the door, shaking the heavy suspension. The operative, Beck, engages the engine and maneuvers the vehicle into the darkness. Within the confined space of the vehicle, the psychological tension is nearly dense enough to measure. Ravina fixates her gaze forward, her respiration shallow, as she anticipates the primary outburst. Beside her, the megalomaniac narcissist stares through the glass. His jaw is clamped so fiercely that the masseter muscle physically throbs. The hand that had restrained her now rests on his own thigh, paralyzed in a state of suppressed violence. He questions her sanity without shifting his ocular focus. His vocal tone projects artificial control, yet there is a subtle, erratic modulation beneath the surface. It is a terrifying blend of rage and unquantifiable panic. Let us examine her verbal countermeasure. She informs him that her sanity was the final casualty of an 8-month deterioration. This forces a physical reaction. He finally turns. Their visual connection inside the dark cabin is highly claustrophobic. She absorbs his thermal radiation and the sharp scent of his cologne, her own physiological arousal masking the vehicle's acoustic hum. He speaks Arsen Korvax's name as if pronouncing a death sentence. He is obsessed with the specific rival she selected. She clinically dismantles his ego by clarifying that Arsen was irrelevant. She simply calculated the exact coordinates required to maximize his distress. She observes his frantic cognitive effort to suppress a volatile emotional eruption. The journey to the Lake Forest compounds consumes 40 minutes of absolute silence. It is a grueling exercise in emotional endurance. Santino's respiration remains elevated in the peripheral darkness. The phantom sensation of his physical restraint still burns against Ravina's wrist, a tactile echo of his dominance. Upon arrival, the facade of unity shatters entirely. Santino abandons her at the entrance, marching through the grand stone foyer. Ravenna trails behind, passing the haunting visual of their untouched anniversary dinner, a monument to their fractured bond. She tracks him to the isolated library. He stands with his back exposed, leaning heavily against a mahogany bookshelf, attempting to regulate his violently fractured composure. The library serves as a psychological containment zone, heavily saturated with the scent of decaying paper and polished wood. Ravina crosses the threshold and seals the door. The auditory click triggers an immediate muscular stiffening in her captor. He interrogates her actions with agonizingly measured precision, listing her offenses. The enemy territory, the hostile crowd, the kiss. She interrupts his interrogation with a clinical observation. She notes that he finally registered the red dress. This breaks him. He pivots rapidly, exposing an emotional frequency she has never documented. The mask of the megalomaniac narcissist is fully shattered. His pupils are dilated, and the microscopic tremors around his mouth betray a catastrophic internal failure. You and I must recognize the tragedy of Stockholm Syndrome in its purest form. She holds her ground, confirming her awareness of the provocation. The emotional payload detonates across his features. He closes the distance, compressing the psychological geometry of the room. The heavy scent of cedar and cologne becomes a suffocating narcotic. Standing mere inches apart, she visually registers the frantic pulse in his neck. The atmospheric charge is overwhelming. This is where the behavioral analysis becomes profoundly haunting. The fundamental lesson here is a tragic one. We often run back to the very source of our pain, mistaking the intensity of the damage for the depth of love. She craves the contact of her tormentor, and she despises herself for that craving. Observe the megalomaniac narcissist in his primary environment. Santino raises his hand, the motor control stalling exactly 1 inch from Luca's face. Let us analyze this together, you and I. This is a classic manifestation of psychopathic restraint. The subject, Luca, stands paralyzed in a red garment, her mind already rationalizing his aggression as a tension. She perceives his inability to ignore her as a victory. In clinical terms, this is the inception of Stockholm Syndrome, where the captive begins to extract validation from the captor's microexpressions. The door closes, leaving her isolated with her delusions of influence, entirely unaware that his retreat was merely a calculated display control over his own predatory impulses, We enter the next phase of the behavioral study, what one might categorize as the domestic hunt. The morning following the social exhibition, the subject, Luca, descends to the kitchen. She attempts to establish an emotional baseline determined to block out her captor. Yet, the moment she crosses the threshold, the psychological gravity shifts. Santino leans against the marble, perfectly composed, exhibiting the classic narcissist's awareness of his domain. He does not offer direct eye contact. Instead, the tension manifests in the tightening of his jaw. Luca immediately registers this microscopic shift. Her trauma bond forces her to become a hyper-vigilant reader of his physical state, interpreting his silent muscular adjustments as a complex form of communication. Luca approaches the counter, maintaining the facade of normalcy by pouring her morning coffee. Note the environmental shift here. For 8 months, the shared silence between captor and captive was defined by clinical indifference. Now the atmospheric pressure has distinctly altered. The quiet possesses an oppressive weight, a heavy psychological texture that neither subject is fully equipped to process. Luca sits opposite to him, seeking an anchor in the mundane act of cooling her beverage. Santino then alters the dynamic completely. He places his cellular device away and directs his focus entirely upon her. This is no longer the dismissive, functional assessment of a warden checking his inventory. The predatory focus has formally shifted toward the prisoner. The visual consumption is slow and deliberate. Luca registers every millimeter of his gaze as it maps her physical presence from her disheveled state to her defensive posture around the warm cup. For a megalomaniac like Santino, observing without the shield of protocol is a calculated stripping of boundaries. He asks if she slept. The auditory cue startles her, not because of the inquiry, but the tonal frequency. It lacks his usual authoritarian timbre. It is lighter, an auditory manipulation designed to disarm the captive. She responds with a hesitant neutrality, asking him the same. He simply drinks from his cup, weaponizing the silence as his reply. He stands, she sits, a classic manifestation of physical dominance disguised as a casual morning interaction. Let us examine the pathology of omission here. The physical barrier of the counter separates them, while the unsaid events of the previous evening saturate the space. Neither verbalizes the incident with the red garment or the aggressive display in the library. By avoiding the subject, the narcissistic controller ensures the tension remains strictly on his terms, amplifying Luca's internal anxiety. Santino simply adjusts his cuff and exits, offering no social closure. Luca is left trying to mentally process this brief proximity. Days pass without resolution. The behavioral observation then shifts to an exterior location. The security personnel, Beck, halts their vehicle at a clandestine entry point of an establishment in the urban center of Chicago. The establishment functions as an extension of the syndicate's territory, a neutral zone where biological sustenance masks primitive territorial disputes. Santino exits the vehicle and breaks his established behavioral pattern. He actively opens Luca's door. The subject hesitates, displaying the natural flinch response of a conditioned captive before accepting his physical contact. His grip is utterly devoid of warmth or empathy. It is an act of spatial possession. By forcing her to walk openly beside him, the megalomaniac broadcasts a clear signal to his rivals. The spouse is no longer a hidden asset. She is a deployed pawn. Luca correctly diagnoses the absence of affection. Yet she complies with the physical tethering, confirming her submission to his narrative. They enter the secure enclosure. 6 subordinate figures already occupy the space. Men who operate purely on transactional violence and hierarchical dominance. Santino physically positions Luca at his immediate right, touching the back of her chair to reinforce his absolute control over her placement. Watch how the subject adapts to the environmental threat. Luca automatically engages her survival mechanism. She performs the expected social pantomime of the obedient spouse. She smiles, she nods. She offers hollow responses to empty inquiries. This is a primary coping strategy in Stockholm Syndrome. The captive adopts the exact behavioral parameters required by the captor, avoiding any intellectual trespass into the dangerous domains of the predators surrounding her. Luca maintains this defensive camouflage for 40 minutes until an aging subordinate directs a calculated provocation at her. Notice the objectification in his phrasing. He refers to her as a jewel. Praising the primary narcissist for keeping his property polished after 8 months of captivity. The room responds with a specific acoustic signature. A collective, restrained laughter. It is the sound of men acknowledging a social transgression that they are entirely unwilling to correct. Luca registers a severe physiological spike. Her skin flushes. The captive instinctually prepares to defend her own dignity, but her neurological response is entirely overridden by her captor. Santino intervenes before a single syllable can escape her mouth. This is perhaps the most fascinating clinical display of his pathology yet. Santino requires no elevation in volume, no distortion of his facial muscles. He simply applies systematic pressure to an expensive crystal vessel until structural failure occurs. The fluid mimics arterial spray, coating his hands and the pristine linen. The entire room enters a state of respiratory paralysis. This is a masterclass in psychological terror from a megalomaniac. He releases the fragments and delivers his command with a flat, deadly affect. He dictates that any reference to his property requires her specific designation and demands absolute ocular submission from the offender. He does not protect Luca out of love. He protects his absolute monopoly over her existence. The offending subordinate immediately exhibits a fear response, losing facial pigmentation and breaking visual contact. Order is brutally restored. Yet, we must observe the profound effect this has on the captive's psychology. For days, Luca obsessively replays the imagery of the fluid staining his skin. She misinterprets this terrifying display of ownership as an act of personal sacrifice, believing he bled for her protection. This cognitive distortion is the bedrock of her trauma bond. The following day introduces a disruptive variable into the controlled environment. Her associate, Tavi, breaches the perimeter of the residence, bringing external stimuli and a chaotic behavioral pattern that directly challenges the sterile isolation of the containment zone. Tavi initiates rapid verbal output, demanding the space adjust to her erratic frequency. She provides sustenance, citing Luca's chronic inability to make basic decisions, a common symptom of long-term psychological suppression. Luca responds with genuine vocal joy. It is crucial to note how the oppressive architecture of the household momentarily fracture under Tavi's overwhelming auditory presence. However, the system's immune response is swift. The security operative, Beck, materializes at the threshold. His physical posture is defensive. He folds his arms, projecting the resigned irritation of a warden forced to tolerate an unsanctioned visitor. The rigid structure of the syndicate is momentarily external chaos, with uncontrollable external chaos. Beck utilizes strict surname identification, stripping the interaction of any familiarity. Tavi counters with immediate verbal antagonism, mocking his rigid, almost mechanical emotional baseline. She challenges his humanity, suggesting he requires a battery charge. Beck meets her aggression with absolute stillness, maintaining visual lock for a full second before citing his optimal sleep cycle as a defense. Tavi escalates, highlighting his total lack of positive affect. The enforcer refuses to engage further. He executes a tactical retreat, abandoning the sector in complete silence. Yet, Luca registers a microscopic muscular anomaly on his face, a phantom twitch. Even the most conditioned operatives exhibit tiny stress fractures when subjected to sustained chaos. Tavi interprets the enforcer's hostile tolerance as affection, a fascinating parallel to Luca's own defensive delusions. Tavi declares that a 12-second interaction equals a marriage proposal in his pathological framework. Their shared laughter provides Luca a temporary illusion of her former identity, briefly untethering her from the identity of the captive spouse. Later, you and I see the subject attempt to assert control over her external reality. She initiates contact with her sibling, Lazaro. He resides in a distant city, sustained by hidden financial streams that her captor has not yet detected. He is her solitary remaining anchor to the biological family unit. Maintaining this secret connection is her final, desperate mechanism of psychological survival. Let us open the file on the subject. Following her mother's death, she assumed the role of absolute caregiver for her brother, Rav. She became his psychological safety net, a structure built entirely on a foundation of deception. She actively maintained the delusion that she was thriving. When Rav asked if everything was okay, the auditory stimulus of his worry triggered an immediate physiological response in her chest. She kept the interaction brief, a calculated survival tactic to minimize forensic traces. She could not afford anyone in that environment discovering her hidden 19-year-old dependent. Upon terminating the call, Tavi observed her with a clinical scrutiny reserved for moments of concealed trauma. Tavi asked if he was okay. The subject affirmed it, masking her internal state. She returned the device to her pocket, internalizing the mandate that he had to be okay. Days later, a profound silence consumed the mansion. It was the specific acoustic void of a massive structure at night, punctuated only by the mechanical rhythm of a clock. Insomnia is a classic symptom of hypervigilance, and that night, the crushing weight of her cognitive load forced her from the bed. She navigated the corridor barefoot, seeking hydration to soothe her autonomic nervous system. The lower level was saturated in an even deeper darkness. Santino habitually severed all illumination when sequestering himself in his study. The only visual stimulus was a severe, narrow beam of light bleeding from beneath his door at the far end of the hallway. You and I must closely examine this next behavioral deviation. She approached the study and halted her forward momentum. The door was marginally ajar, a gap no wider than 2 digits, allowing Santino's low, drawling occupational tone to escape. A rational preservation instinct would have dictated continued movement. 8 months of proximity to a criminal organism had conditioned her to recognize the strict boundary between his illicit operations and the domestic sphere. Yet, her motor functions ceased before conscious processing occurred. She positioned herself against the wall, her heart rate decelerating, her auditory senses hyper-focused. This was no mutual dialogue. The extended pauses indicated a unilateral reception of information from an unseen entity on the other end of the line. Only the absolute silence of the unverified individual on the line permeated the space. Then, Santino articulated a specific identifier twice, utilizing a low frequency that loaded 2 syllables with immense psychological gravity. Silas. The subject lacked any pre-existing data on this nomenclature. She did not comprehend the operational context, nor why Santino expelled the word with an inflection oscillating violently between rage and visceral disgust. However, her deeply ingrained survival pathology, the identical mechanism that commanded her to scan environments for threat vectors and hoard psychological leverage, activated instantly. She committed the auditory data to her permanent memory. A solitary, sharp acoustic click signaled the communication device making contact with the wooden desk. She initiated a retrograde movement to retreat to the upper level, but collided with a human form. Santino was positioned directly behind her. There had been zero auditory warning of his exit, no friction of a door, no footfalls on the flooring. His manifestation was so immediate that the physiological shock arrested her respiratory function. He inquired about her nocturnal activity, his tone descending from above, vibrating directly against her epidermis. She cited the need for water, projecting a vocal stability that completely contradicted the severe tachycardia hammering in her throat. She refused to rotate her body. His proximity was absolute, saturating the immediate atmosphere with his thermal output and the heavy, lingering signature of his cologne in the darkened corridor. The atmospheric density shifted as they remained locked in mutual stasis. Then he initiated physical contact, targeting her wrist. His fingers enclosed the joint with calculated, minimal pressure, not to restrain, but to establish a sensory baseline. His skin registered at a high thermal index, the interaction persisting for precisely 1 second. It was a sufficient duration to trigger a massive neurological response in her limb, and to confirm with terrifying psychological clarity that he felt the energetic transfer too. He released the hold, executing a tactical retreat down the corridor. She remained immobilized, her wrist maintaining a phantom thermal signature, while the identifier, Silas, rhythmically pulsed within her cognitive framework, alongside the memory of his touch. 2 uninvited variables had entered her psychological matrix, guaranteeing the continuation of her insomnia. Let us observe the environmental parallel. A severe storm struck Chicago at the end of that week, unleashing a brutality indicative of long-suppressed kinetic energy. Wind currents battered the exterior glass with rhythmic hostility, rapidly followed by an aggressive deluge. She occupied the suite, mechanically holding a text. She had failed to process for 30 minutes when the security gate sounded. Such mobility was standard protocol. Beck and Santino operated outside normative circadian rhythms, and her survival conditioning had successfully suppressed any verbal inquiries regarding their covert coordinates, knowing any data provided would invariably be fabricated. Behavioral analysis noted a distinct elevation in Santino's baseline tension prior to departure. She monitored his descent alongside Beck. His physical posture, the rigid skeletal alignment, the clenched jaw, broadcasted the somatic reality of an apex predator entering a highly volatile engagement. Time dilated as the storm intensified. She executed 4 positional shifts on the mattress, scanning the identical text 3 times without cognitive retention. At no point did she consciously articulate the reality of her vigil. To label her state as waiting would require admitting an emotional investment, and forming a psychological attachment to a dominant criminal figure remained an unauthorized risk within her internal protocols. Near 2300 hours, the perimeter mechanisms engaged. The auditory data escalated. Engine termination, door impacts, and urgent vocalizations bleeding into the corridor. Their frequency injected a freezing physiological response down her spine. She abandoned the suite, descending the stairs barefoot. Near the vehicle bay, she observed Beck, supporting a significant percentage of Santino's body mass. Santino exhibited an asymmetric gait, his hand pressing his opposite limb. Through his fingers, she processed the dark biological fluid saturating his shirt, blood. Her internal organs contracted. She swallowed the aquaphanic panic, locked her jaw, and initiated a controlled forward trajectory. She relied entirely on autonomous motor function to project absolute stability, expertly masking the reality that her internal neurological network was actively screaming. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? Beck registered her presence first, recalibrating the wounded man's center of gravity. He deployed extreme verbal economy, classifying the trauma as a graze from an ambush. Santino attempted to project invulnerability, though his vocal cords lacked the tension to support the ruse. She neutralized his delusion immediately, citing his active hemorrhaging. She inserted her physical structure beneath his uninjured side to absorb the burden Beck carried. Santino's micro-expressions betrayed cognitive dissonance, the profound shock of a solitary predator encountering unsolicited support. He offered zero resistance. The triad navigated the ascent methodically, his massive physical weight, forcing her to abandon any pretense of detachment. His blood saturated her sleepwear, mixing the metallic scent of iron with his chemical profile. Beck positioned the injured man on the bathtub's edge and withdrew silently, securing the door. She was confined with him in the sterile washroom. The severe luminosity and the sudden vacuum of silence amplified the psychological intensity. She retrieved the medical supplies. Her knowledge of the inventory was deliberate. She had organized that compartment during her initial phase in the house. It was a textbook coping mechanism, utilizing micro-organization to generate a synthetic illusion of mastery over an uncontrollable existence. She systematically unfastened his garment, peeling the compromised fabric away to analyze the structural tissue damage. The graze was, as reported, authentic. The projectile had carved a superficial trench across his shoulder, exhibiting active hemorrhaging without internal penetration. The physiological relief she experienced at this data was a disproportionate response for a subject actively maintaining a facade of apathy. She saturated a sterile pad with antiseptic, cautioning him regarding the impending pain stimulus. He maintained a fixed forward gaze, dryly citing his historical survival of superior ballistic traumas. She clinically dismissed his bravado, noting that historical data does not negate current neurological pain responses. She executed the decontamination protocol in absolute silence. Her measured precision was indicative of deeply ingrained behavioral conditioning, likely acquired during her years of parentified caregiving. Let us analyze this final interaction. Her operational calmness under duress is a classic trauma adaptation. Santino exhibited total autonomic control, producing no micro-expressions or vocalizations of distress. His suppression of pain was a psychological variable she could not categorize as impressive or alarming. She applied adhesive dermal closures with calculated tension to align the severed tissue, securing a sterile barrier to restrict fluid loss without inhibiting his kinetic range. She sanitized her digits at the basin. The harsh illumination highlighted the muscular topography of his torso, a visual stimulus she attempted to filter, yet her nervous system processed it completely. She declared the procedure finalized, clinically confirming his continued biological viability. Observe the subject as she examines the bloody bandage. Note the micro-expressions on Santino's face. We must understand that a megalomaniac narcissist like Santino lacks the neurological pathways for genuine gratitude. What she witnesses is not thanks, but a cold, transactional realization. When he forces the words "thank you," it is a painful, calculated omission. As she automatically marker of stocktaker role, a behavioral marker of Stockholm Syndrome, she picks up his jacket. A single piece of paper dislodges from the inner pocket, a hurried note, a single letter, S. You and I can see how this tiny physical artifact is about to shatter the psychological boundaries they have established in this isolated clinical setting. The document reveals 3 precise data points: Amato, Doc 9, 11 p.m. Instantly, the subject experiences a severe somatic response, a sudden drop in core temperature, as her trauma memory activates. The auditory recall of Santino whispering Silas Amato in a dark corridor violently aligns with the text in her hand. The architect of the ambush is exposed. All the while, Santino monitors her from the sterile environment of the bathroom. He acts as the apex predator, clinically assessing her next move. Will she leverage this intelligence for her own survival? Or has the trauma bond fully solidified her submission? She holds the ultimate psychological weapon, capable of altering their entire power dynamic in a fraction of a second. In any standard behavioral model, the subject should hoard this intelligence as a mechanism for basic self-preservation. Historically, she has relied on deep psychological dissociation in this environment, actively ignoring the systemic violence surrounding her. Yet, the insidious nature of Stockholm Syndrome drives her to abandon her own safety. She crosses the room and surrenders the physical evidence to her captor. Santino accepts it, his ocular focus narrowing into an intense predatory stare designed to crush her resolve. "Where did you find this?" he asks. "And you read it." We must recognize these are not genuine questions, but calculated tests of psychological dominance. Remarkably, the subject maintains direct eye contact, defying the established hierarchy. She clearly articulates her awareness of the betrayal, citing the auditory memory of the name Silas. Let us analyze his reaction together. His facial muscles lock in complete paralysis for exactly 3 seconds. In criminal pathology, this micro-freeze indicates a rapid, expert cognitive recalculation. Finally, he exhales, his physical tension collapsing into a cold surrender to the facts. He clinically details that a subordinate capo engineered the near-fatal ambush. When she presses him on his retaliatory strategy, a profound neurological shift occurs within him. For the first time in their destructive dynamic, the megalomaniac narcissist stops viewing her as a mere contractual hostage. He suddenly perceives her as a chosen, vital ally. She is no longer categorized in his mind as an inanimate contractual asset or a silent, dissociative ghost haunting his corridors. By willingly surrendering the critical intelligence, she has actively integrated herself into his violent pathology. "Tomorrow," he announces flatly, "tomorrow, I take care of it." This is a classic sociopathic euphemism for a scheduled execution. Outside, a violent storm batters the glass, providing an external mirror to their psychological volatility. Santino drags his wounded body onto the freezing balcony, utilizing the extreme sensory input of the rain to regulate his turbulent internal state. Entirely consumed by her trauma bond, the subject mindlessly follows her captor out into the unforgiving cold and the darkness. She inserts herself directly into his physical space, allowing the freezing rain to brutally shock her nervous system. "You could have kept the data," he notes, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. "You could have weaponized it against me. Why did you not?" The interrogative hangs suspended in the violent weather. The subject desperately attempts to rationalize her actions through a standard, neurotypical moral framework. She wants to believe she acted out of intrinsic goodness, or perhaps a rejection of spiteful manipulation. Yet, cognitive dissonance heavily masks her true motivation. We must remember a dark truth about human nature here. When we are starved of genuine connection, our minds will sacrifice objective reality just to feel a sense of belonging. The subject finally confesses the collapse of her defensive dissociation. "Because I live in this residence," she states, signaling a total psychological assimilation into her captor's controlled environment. The spatial boundary between predator and prey instantly evaporates. Santino angles his face, pressing his forehead directly against hers. Take careful note of this behavior. There is no romantic kiss. Instead, this intense tactile pressure serves as a raw manifestation of absolute possession, representing a severe short circuit in the megalomaniac's highly organized brain. "I do not know how to process you," he admits into the storm. Coming from an apex manipulator, this is a staggering, unprecedented confession of complete cognitive failure. Her cardiovascular system predictably spikes in a textbook autonomic response, yet she remains entirely immobilized by her deep, traumatic attachment. She shuts her eyes, attempting to anchor the massive psychological burden of the recent violence and systemic betrayal onto this singular point of physical contact. "Process this slowly," she instructs him, displaying a dangerous illusion of control. After a significant hesitation, the captor physically detaches, exhibiting a visible neurological resistance to severing their strange connection. Left isolated in the freezing downpour, the subject is struck by a terrifying moment of absolute clarity. The strict, predictable behavioral parameters of their clinical isolation have fundamentally ruptured. No artificial contractual agreement could ever contain the brutal biological reality of extreme trauma bonding. The atmospheric turbulence violently persists until dawn. The subject experiences acute insomnia, driven not by her chronic isolation, but by a hyper-aroused nervous system actively processing their mutated dynamic. At 0800 hours, she encounters a stark, deliberate environmental anomaly in the dining sector. For 8 consecutive months, the megalomaniac utilized rigid physical barriers like massive stacks of dossiers to enforce strict emotional distance. Today, the sterile surface is entirely devoid of any obstruction. He sits completely still, tracking her entry with an unblinking, hyper-focused predatory gaze. The subject initiates their rigid morning ritual, dispensing the coffee while bracing for psychological impact. She has learned that communicating with a pathological narcissist requires carefully navigating intense, weaponized periods of silence. "I was cruel," he finally states. He actively avoids direct optical engagement, repetitively manipulating the ceramic object in his hands to displace his internal tension. You and I must recognize the sheer magnitude of this clinical anomaly. He utilizes his standard, authoritative vocal frequency, yet the actual phrasing constitutes an unprecedented admission of guilt regarding his prior psychological warfare. She grounds herself against the thermal heat of her cup, letting his confession permeate the room. A highly damaged, desperate sector of her psyche urgently wishes to absorb this micro-validation and instantly repair their fractured emotional bond. However, prolonged psychological deprivation has unexpectedly forged a hardened, resilient core within her brain. She refuses to instantly erase 8 months of systematic, targeted neglect. "You inflicted severe psychological trauma upon me," she articulates, maintaining a shockingly stable vocal effect. She clinically lists his exact transgressions, From the forced solitary confinement during meals to the calculated reduction of her human existence into a mere clerical error. In response to this highly dangerous, direct confrontation, the captor finally elevates his visual focus to meet hers. His mandibular muscles visibly contract under the skin. This is an involuntary, autonomic defense mechanism, the instinct of a deeply guarded apex predator attempting to immediately seal off a sudden emotional vulnerability. Remarkably, he actively overrides the impulse. He forces his own mind to endure the uncomfortable exposure. The subject continues her strict behavioral correction, stating that a singular verbal apology cannot magically rewrite ingrained neurological trauma. This recovery process will require an indefinite temporal investment, she asserts firmly. You and I can learn a vital life lesson from this clinical exchange. True emotional healing never begins with a quick apology. It demands the painful mutual endurance of uncomfortable truth. I register your input, he replies quietly. Let us analyze his precise lexicon here. The megalomaniac does not offer false neurotypical empathy, nor does he fabricate an impossible guarantee of rapid behavioral rehabilitation. He simply confirms his receipt of her emotional data. For a subject subjected to months of profound psychological invalidation, this baseline acknowledgement acts as a highly addictive narcotic. They finish their beverages in a mutually negotiated, quiet, fundamentally different from his prior punitive isolation tactics. By 1400 hours, however, the violent external reality aggressively breaches their clinical bubble. Armored vehicles enter the perimeter, deploying operatives prepared for immediate, lethal consequence. The subject, whom we will refer to as the wife, positioned herself at the top of the main staircase. Below her, the Valerie clan captains gathered in the mansion's basement, a subterranean space reinforcing the psychological divide between the domestic facade and the criminal reality. The heavy reinforced door in the west corridor acted as a physical barrier to her cognitive dissonance. Beck, the clear nonverbal bard, projecting a clear nonverbal boundary. Unsummoned, the wife remained on the step, a passive observer in her own trauma narrative. She listened to the deep murmur of voices, unable to decipher the exact linguistics, but highly attuned to the aggressive tonal shifts. This classic adaptive in environments governed by unpredictable violence. From a behavioral standpoint, the alpha figure, the dialogue with a regulated, low-arousal vocal pattern. Look, we often see this baseline control in high-functioning sociopaths. Remo, the 52-year-old consigliere, likely responded next. His historical interactions with the wife always carried a flat, evaluative affect, perceiving her merely as a logistical variable. Suddenly, the acoustic environment escalated. Multiple voices overlapped, increasing in pitch and urgency, signaling a breakdown in group cohesion. When the basement door finally yielded, Beck emerged first, followed by Silas Amato. Silas exhibited all the physiological markers of acute stress. His rapid eye movements and rigid posture indicated a sympathetic nervous system in free fall, fully aware his operational status had been terminally revoked. Let us examine this moment together, as it illustrates the mechanics of institutionalized terror. Two enforcers guided Silas through the lateral exit toward the rear courtyard. He avoided all visual contact, a classic submission display, entirely oblivious to the wife observing his final procession. She noted every measured step, internalizing the lethal finality of a traitor exiting the rear door of a Valeria summit. Her physiological response, a synthesis of relief and abject horror, firmly rooted her to the staircase. Finally, Santino appeared, He adjusted his cuff, an obsessive-compulsive micro-expression of re-establishing control, and locked his vision onto the wife. For 3 full seconds, they held eye contact. He offered a slight cranial tilt, not a gesture of respect, but a cold validation of their shared complicity. The nonverbal transaction was complete. She had provided the intelligence, and he had executed the sanction. The basement door closed with a definitive auditory cue, compartmentalizing the violence away from the domestic sphere. The wife remained stationary, her heart rate stabilizing, fully processing that the slip of paper she had surrendered in the dark corridor had permanently terminated a biological existence. Clinically speaking, she exhibited an alarming absence of guilt. Silas had previously compromised Santino, resulting in an ambush, ballistic trauma, and a covert medical intervention performed by her own hands. Her rationalization of the lethal outcome demonstrates a severe erosion of normative morality, proving how rapidly a human mind recalibrates its ethical boundaries when subjected to the pressures of a predatory environment. 24 hours post-incident, the environmental stimuli within the residence dropped to an absolute minimum. The enforcers had dispersed. The domestic staff, specifically Donna Marta, had evacuated the premises early, leaving behind a simple meal and a handwritten directive addressed to Mrs. Valerii. That specific title, often used as an instrument of psychological confinement, elicited a micro-smile from the subject, indicating a growing identification with her captor's domain. Rather than utilizing the formal dining space, Santino invaded the kitchen territory. He initiated the consumption of alcohol without preliminary negotiation, placing 2 glasses on the granite surface. They engaged in sustenance behavior on elevated stools, the physical proximity and uncharacteristic informality, creating a disorienting contrast to their baseline hostility. Substance intake often lowers the inhibitory barriers of even the most guarded, megalomaniac narcissists. Somewhere around the second glass of wine, the prolonged silence mutated from combative to accommodating. Santino bypassed the immediate trauma regarding Silas and shifted the narrative to the afternoon syndicate gathering. He recounted a specific behavioral display he performed in front of his subordinate captains. He explicitly clarified to his ranks that the subject was not a strategic asset or a contractual obligation, but his voluntary selection. This verbal affirmation triggered a profound somatic response in the wife. She experienced a sudden vasodilation, a rush of thermal energy radiating outward from her chest. Gripping her glassware tightly to mask the involuntary tremors cascading through her central nervous system. Let's examine the pathology of this encounter. Santino's face, a carefully built mask used to control and intimidate, suddenly appeared totally open. This calculated vulnerability looked like a genuine surrender. When the captive asked about his syndicate meeting, Santino coldly replied it wasn't a consultation. The subject laughed, a desperate release of tension, earning a slight lift of Santino's mouth. A megalomaniac narcissist never gives fully, yet the victim valued that half-smile more than pure joy from anyone else. It is a haunting truth that in deep isolation, we often mistake the mere absence of cruelty for profound love. Without a single spoken word, they ascended the main staircase together, locked in a perfectly synchronized, deeply dangerous psychological dance. They moved upward in the same rhythm, a physical manifestation of severe trauma bonding. When Santino bypassed his study for the master suite, the silent pivot was a non-verbal command. Seeking comfort in the dark, the captive lit the stone fireplace, untouched during 8 lonely months of confinement. Santino shut the door. The heavy click of the latch wasn't perceived as a prison lock, but rather a mutual choice. This is exactly how a breaking mind protects itself. The kingpin leaned against the wood, his dark eyes catching the firelight. The victim romanticized his cold stare, deeply believing he was finally tearing down his emotional walls. We must remember that a predator's calculated patience often perfectly disguises itself as romantic devotion to a desperate, starving prey. Notice the profound physiological confusion happening here. The captive felt the crushing weight on his gaze, turning simple breathing into a forced effort. This is a severe trauma response, perfectly disguised as romance. As the crime boss advanced, his measured steps caused the floor to vibrate. The victim could no longer distinguish between a heavy predator approaching and the frantic pounding of their own heart. He closed the gap, weaponizing sensory overload to bypass the brain's rational defenses. He raised a hand to trace their jawline, resting his thumb near their mouth. The pressure was deceptively light, manufacturing a brilliant illusion of consent. True psychological control always lies in making the captive deeply believe they actually begged for the cage. In severe trauma bonds, the victim often initiates the final surrender to maintain a false sense of agency. They lifted their face and kissed him. The initial contact was a masterclass in manipulation as Santino cracking distigadas, his hand slid to the back of their neck, physically securing his prey under the guise of passion. The subject gripped his shirt, feeling the kingpin's heaving chest. They tragically interpreted his heartbeat as vulnerability, rather than the raw thrill of a predator finally consuming its stalked prize. The kiss rapidly mutated. His calculated restraint collapsed into a consuming hunger, releasing 8 months of deep psychological conditioning in one brutal wave. This tragic moment reveals just how easily a broken mind can confuse dangerous possession with genuine human connection. The physical dynamics here are about absolute dominance. Santino's hand locked onto their waist, pulling with a violent force that lifted the subject entirely off the floor. Removing a victim's physical grounding is a stark tactic to cement total dependency. In response, wrapped their arms around, clinging to the very source of their terror. He carried them to the bed, executing a seamless transition of power. He laid his weight down with a deceptive care that contrasted wildly with his brutal intensity. When he pulled back, the captive looked into his dark eyes and hallucinated a raw vulnerability that made their own heart ache. They saw pure love where there was only absolute ownership. Desperate people will often project their deepest emotional needs onto the exact monsters actively tearing them apart. The subject's psychological capture was now terminal. Santino softly asked if they were sure. "I see this tactic constantly. The false exit. The narcissist offers an illusion of choice, only when they know the victim is too broken to flee." The captive replied that after 8 months of deep uncertainty, this submission was their only certainty. They pulled the crime boss closer, sealing the trauma bond. His hands undid their clothing with a practiced predatory deftness. As the fabric fell, Santino froze. The victim falsely felt that for the very first time, they truly existed under his intense gaze. The clinical tragedy here is absolute. Complete psychological destruction isn't when a captor violently breaks you. It is when they finally convince you that your entire human existence depends entirely on their dangerous, controlling attention. Let us open the file on this particular evening, shall we? You and I must look past the illusion of romance to see the clinical reality. The subject unbuttoned Santino's shirt, her fingers trembling with what she misidentified as affection, rather than the deeply ingrained trauma response it truly was. She touched the bandage on his left shoulder, the very dressing she had applied the night before. She perceived her own gesture as tenderness, yet Santino held her hand against his wound, projecting an unspoken message of mutual sacrifice. The narcissistic mind thrives on this. He evaluated every curve of her body with the methodical precision of a predator cataloging his assets. It was not passion. It was an exercise in absolute, terrifying control, disguised as intimacy. His physical dominance was calculated to trigger a complete psychological surrender. The heat she felt, the loss of breath as she gripped the sheets, was the physiological manifestation of a trauma bond sealing itself shut. He commanded her to look at him, his voice rough, intentionally stripping away his public mask to make her feel chosen. This is classic megalomaniac behavior. He settled against her with a calculated heaviness, ensuring she felt the impossibility of escape. He moved with a slow restraint that she desperately wanted to believe was cracking. When he buried a muffled, deep sound against her neck, he fed her exactly the illusion of vulnerability she required to justify her complete submission. She believed it was desire. It was possession. The pacing of the encounter was meticulously engineered. Every movement was deep and measured, forcing her breathing to synchronize with his own. She ran her hands down his tense back, convinced she was witnessing his struggle for control amidst the heavy breathing and the firelight. Then came the defining statement. He pressed his forehead to hers and stated, "I am not letting you go." Notice the phrasing. Not a declaration of love, but a statement of ownership. His voice was hoarse, acting the part of the untouchable kingpin breaking down. Her response, claiming she was not going anywhere, was the ultimate verbal confirmation of Stockholm Syndrome. Her identity had dissolved entirely into his gravitational pull, masked by heat and fragmented breath. The physiological climax served as the final psychological anchor. The subject describes a wave crashing through her with an intensity that forced her sensory eyes shut, a complete sensory overload. Santino followed, his body locking, surrendering his weight in a manner that starkly contradicted his previous 8 months of ironclad emotional regulation. As their breathing slowed and the amber firelight cast shadows across the room, he brushed the hair from her face. It was an automatic, proprietary gesture. She interpreted his expression as that of a man who had joyfully lost a war against himself. In clinical terms, he had not lost a war. He had successfully dismantled her final defenses, securing a psychological captive under the guise of mutual surrender. Let us pause here and evaluate her mental state. You and I can clearly recognize the cognitive distortion at play. He repeated his claim of ownership, whispering, "I am not letting you go." She touched his jaw, accepting the terms of her captivity, and allowed him to pull her against his chest. The mansion was completely silent, isolating them from reality. Lying against the heartbeat of Santino Valerius, a man who had systematically broken her autonomy over 8 months, she convinced herself she was finally safe. She fell asleep believing she was in the right place, entirely blind to the fact that she had just willingly locked the door to her own psychological chapter prison. This marks the transition into Chapter 6, the morning her reality was fully rewritten. The morning after is a textbook study in post-trauma reinforcement. She woke to the scent of coffee and an empty but warm bed. The suite was lit by morning sun, the fireplace reduced to cold ash. She realized she was wearing his oversized white shirt, her hands swallowed by the sleeves. She had no memory of him dressing her. Rather than feeling alarmed by this non-consensual manipulation of her unconscious body, her trauma-bonded mind reframed it as an act of profound care. The thought of the mob boss quietly buttoning his shirt over her shoulders caused a warm expansion in her chest. She wandered down to the kitchen barefoot, cloaked in his garment, proudly wearing the physical uniform of her captor without a single trace of self-preservation. The environmental perception of the subject shifted to match her internal submission. The stone corridors and tall windows of the Lake Forest mansion had not changed, yet she projected a lighter atmosphere onto them, believing the house itself was finally breathing. In the kitchen, she encountered Beck, a peripheral enforcer in Santino's syndicate. He stood by the marble counter, holding a mug and a stale pastry that belonged to Taffy, another associate. The subject noted the pastry had survived in the refrigerator like an archaeological artifact. Beck consumed it with deadpan solemnity. When she walked in, he raised the pastry in a silent, minimal greeting. To the subject, this normalized domesticity was comforting. To us, it is merely the mundane routine of violent men. The interaction that followed is a classic normalization of abnormal environments. The subject confronted Beck about eating the labeled pastry, noting Taffy's name was written with a heart. Beck, displaying the flat affect typical of antisocial enforcers, rationally concluded he would rather eat the food than listen to complaints about it. The subject laughed. She was finding humor and camaraderie among individuals who routinely orchestrated violence. Beck continued eating, completely unbothered, having delivered what she considered a remarkably long sentence for him. Then the primary psychological variable entered. Santino appeared in the kitchen doorway just as she poured her coffee. He leaned against the frame, crossing his arms, silently observing the territory he controlled. You and I need to pay close attention to this next behavioral exchange. Santino took in the sight of her, wearing his shirt, standing alongside his enforcer. The subject read his expression, not as his usual ironclad control, but as surprise as if he had accidentally discovered a domestic scene inside his own fortress. She handed him a mug, and he ensured their fingers brushed. That brief, intentional physical contact was designed to hijack her nervous system, stealing her breath in an instant. He drank his coffee while maintaining steady, unfiltered eye contact. She described the sensation as the sweet weight of being seen, no longer monitored or assessed. In reality, the megalomaniac narcissist was simply admiring his most prized acquisition, fully integrated into his domain. Beck washed his hands and exited with a nod, intuitively recognizing that the alpha required isolation with his subject. They were left alone in a kitchen that, for 8 months, had been a battleground of hostile silences and profound isolation. The subject perceived the stark contrast of this new morning as proof of a new life. They walked out the back door toward the expansive gardens. Santino stayed close, his hand brushing hers, without fully committing to a hold, keeping her in a state of hypervigilance and anticipation. They reached the wooden deck overlooking a narrow lake. The still water reflected the Chicago sky, presenting a facade of peace that perfectly mirrored the deceptive calm of her newly solidified trauma bond. The psychological trap was fully set. The illusion of equality is the final stage of the captor's manipulation. By the afternoon, the subject knocked on his study door and entered without waiting a year. She proudly noted this was a habit he had not corrected, mistakenly believing she had earned genuine authority. Santino sat behind his oak desk, the operational center of his criminal enterprise. Seeing her, he abruptly ended his phone call, signaling her elevated status. She sat in the visitor's chair and announced she needed to speak. She experienced a moment of clarity, realizing she used to feel like a mere visitor in that room, but no longer did. It is a tragic cognitive failure. She felt like an equal partner, completely unaware that she remained nothing more than a permanent resident of his cage. You and I have arrived at the critical stress test of their new relationship pattern. She told him that her brother Lazaro wanted to visit. For 8 entire months, she had hidden Lazaro, funding him through a secret account to protect him from Santino. Now she was willingly offering her brother's name to the kingpin. She interpreted this surrender of her only defense as the ultimate act of mutual trust. Santino's reaction tells the true story. His response was delayed by just half a second. In that microscopic window, something flashed across his features and was instantly smothered before she could decode it. It was not anger, nor was it a refusal. It was the rapid, predatory calculation of a narcissist, realizing his captive had just handed over the only remaining piece of her outside world. Let us examine the subject, Lena. In her file, she documents a micro-expression, a fleeting crack in the megalomaniac narcissist's mask. Santino recovered with chilling speed, his voice softening into a calculated, soothing tone. She searched his features for the hostility she instinctively sensed, but found only the fabricated warmth he deployed to disarm his victims. Here, we see the onset of trauma bonding. She rationalizes his erratic behavior. She tells herself it is merely the natural caution of an apex predator processing threats. This is how the human mind protects itself from terror, by painting a monster in the colors of a misunderstood protector. She let it go. You and I must remember that ignoring our primal instincts is the first step toward our own ruin. He rose from the desk and extended his hand. When he pulled her up, the grip was carefully measured. Lena documented her surprise at this gentle firmness, a classic cognitive trap. She was marveling that hands capable of running a criminal empire and crushing glass could also show restraint. This is the duality of the psychopath, weaponizing tenderness to confuse the prey. Together, they walked through the foyer and out toward the lake. The late afternoon painted the sky in bruising shades of amber and gray, casting long, psychological shadows across the pristine lawn maintained by Donna Marta. It is a terrifying realization, seeing a captive mistake calculated control for genuine affection. A predator's gentle touch is often just a test of the leash. They paused at the edge of the water, the lake perfectly mirroring the dying light. In the distance stood the iron gates, crowned by the Valeri family crest, a black hawk with spread wings. When I review cases of severe Stockholm Syndrome, symbols of captivity always shift in the victim's mind. 8 months prior, Lena arrived in a white dress with dry, terrified eyes. She had looked at that iron bird and correctly identified it as a life sentence. It represented an inescapable psychological prison, complete with high stone walls and a husband who viewed her merely as an acquired asset. Yet the human brain cannot sustain constant panic. It adapts. We learn the hard way that when you cannot escape the cage, you eventually convince yourself you chose to walk inside. Lena lowered her gaze to her hand, absently twisting her wedding band. For 8 months, this gesture had been a physical manifestation of her acute anxiety. But suddenly, the ring fit perfectly. It no longer pinched. The profound tragedy here is not that the metal changed, but that her physiological defense mechanisms had finally collapsed. Her hand had relaxed into her captivity. Santino took her fingers without asking, seamlessly integrating his dominance into her routine. She felt the weight of the exact same hand that authorized executions and bruised her wrists, now resting against her skin with a manufactured gentleness. It is a chilling reminder of our vulnerability. The most dangerous manipulation happens when the violence becomes familiar enough to feel safe. She stared at the iron hawk once more. The dark silhouette against the twilight no longer registered as a threat in her mind. Instead, her fractured psyche reframed the predator as a sentinel, a guardian keeping her safe. She stood by the water with his hand in hers, internally declaring this a conscious choice. She believed she was staying not out of contractual obligation or mortal fear, but out of free will. This is the absolute apex of the megalomaniac narcissist's victory, convincing the victim to lock her own cell. The real lesson here is that our minds will rewrite reality just to survive it. This concludes the first phase of her psychiatric case file. The second volume of these clinical observations is now available, requiring only a nominal fee to access. The delusion shattered when she breached his safe and found the hidden contract. Line 1 held her name. Line 2 contained a single, devastating word: transfer. The third line triggered a severe panic response. Just 3 weeks prior, Santino had stood before his syndicate, effectively branding her as his property, securing her total psychological submission. She had started to trust the monster, yet while she slept in his bed, he was negotiating her fate. With Arsen Korvac harboring a secret correspondence from a woman in his past. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Trusting a sociopath always yields the same bitter harvest. She was suddenly forced to confront a reality no captive wants to face, realizing that to an apex predator, you are never a partner, only currency. As I noted, this brief review barely scratches the surface of the psychological wreckage in the second case file. To examine the complete, uncensored behavioral data, direct your attention to the primary link located in the pinned commentary below. I will meet you in the subsequent briefing room. By accessing that designated portal, you bypass all interruptions and secure the unabridged documentation. I find profound academic value in dissecting these increasingly severe psychological profiles, and your continued engagement suggests a shared clinical fascination. These case studies plunge deep into the darkest, most unfiltered mechanics of trauma bonding and control, exploring territories far too graphic and disturbing for a standard public broadcast on this platform.
The story follows Ravenna, a woman trapped in an arranged marriage with Santino Valeri. For 8 months, she lives in a beautiful mansion, but feels completely alone. She has the title of wife, but not the warmth, care, or emotional presence that should come with marriage. The scene where she carefully prepares a dinner table for their 8-month anniversary, only to be ignored by Santino, is especially powerful. It shows that emotional neglect can hurt as deeply as direct cruelty. Sometimes what breaks a person is not one harsh sentence, but the repeated silence of someone who refuses to see them. The first important lesson from this story is the value of self-respect. When Santino tells Ravenna, "I don't want you as my wife," I never did. She is deeply hurt, but she does not collapse in front of him. Instead, she chooses to leave the room with dignity. Her decision to wear the red dress, apply red lipstick, and step out of the house becomes a symbol of reclaiming her identity. It is not just rebellion, it is a statement. I still exist. In life, there are moments when people may treat us as if we are invisible. The lesson is that we must never become invisible to ourselves. However, the story should also be understood wisely. Ravenna going to the party of Santino's enemy creates strong drama for a YouTube audience, but it is not necessarily the healthiest way to solve real-life relationship problems. The educational message should not be, make someone jealous so they notice you. Instead, the deeper message is, do not suffer silently when you are being emotionally neglected. Find your voice. Stand up for yourself, but do so in a way that protects your dignity, safety, and future. The second lesson is that marriage or love cannot survive on titles alone. Ravenna and Santino are husband and wife legally, but emotionally, they are strangers for most of the story. A relationship is not built by a ring, a contract, or a public image. It is built by communication, care, presence, and respect. Santino only begins to truly notice Ravenna when she stops accepting the role of the silent, unwanted wife. This reflects a painful truth. Sometimes people only recognize someone's value when that person stops allowing themselves to be taken for granted. The third lesson is that an apology does not immediately erase pain. Later in the story, Santino admits that he was cruel, but Ravenna does not instantly pretend everything is fine. She tells him that he hurt her not only that night, but every night before it, every lonely dinner, every empty hallway, every moment when she tried to exist in the house and was treated like a mistake. This is a very meaningful point. In real life, saying sorry is only the beginning. A true apology must be followed by consistent change. The person who caused pain must be patient, and the person who was hurt has the right to need time to heal. The fourth lesson is that self-worth must come before love. Ravenna does not become valuable because Santino finally notices her. She was valuable from the beginning. The real transformation is not only that Santino changes, but that Ravenna starts seeing herself differently. She realizes she does not have to live like a shadow in someone else's house. This is a powerful educational message. Do not wait for another person to confirm your worth before you believe in it yourself. Your value is not decided by how much attention someone gives you. The fifth lesson is the importance of honest communication. Much of the pain between Ravenna and Santino comes from silence, pride, and emotional avoidance. Santino hides behind control. Ravenna endures too much before speaking clearly. Only when they begin to tell the truth does their relationship have a chance to change. This applies not only to marriage, but also to family, friendship, and education. Silence can protect us for a short time, but if it becomes a habit, it creates distance. Real understanding begins when people are brave enough to speak honestly and listen sincerely. From a YouTube content point of view, the story has many strong elements: a powerful opening, emotional conflict, a strong female lead, a mysterious male character, and many dramatic turning points. These are useful for keeping viewers engaged, but to make the video more meaningful, the narrator should not focus only on the drama. The video should highlight the emotional and moral lessons behind the plot. For example, after important scenes, the narrator could add reflections such as, "A person can forgive, but they should not forget their own worth," or "Love is not ownership. Love is a responsible choice." In conclusion, Ravenna's story teaches us that emotional neglect can be just as damaging as open conflict. A beautiful house can still feel like a prison if there is no respect inside it. A marriage can look perfect from the outside, but feel empty when one person is unseen. Ravenna's journey is meaningful because she does not simply fight for Santino's love. She fights to remember who she is. The greatest lesson from this story is: love deeply, but do not lose your dignity. Forgive when change is real, but do not ignore repeated pain. And stay only when staying is your free choice, not your silent surrender. Ravenna's strength reminds us that the most important relationship we must protect is the relationship we have with ourselves.